Hello and welcome to Positive Fandom. I'm your host, We certainly do have a wonderful guest tonight here on Positive Fandom. We're going to be talking about 3,000 Years of Longing with Kamran Pasha, guys. Please do stick around. You won't be disappointed. See you in a few seconds. Well, hello, everybody. I'm so excited tonight. Uh, I'm going to be reviewing a movie that I've been so passionate about, have enjoyed so much with a guest that I so respect and admire. I'd like to introduce tonight our special guest, Mr. Kamran Pasha, everybody.
What a delight! I don't. I think is this the first time I've been on your channel? I feel like I might have been before, but this might be the first time.
I think this is the first time that you've been on my channel, and it is such a pleasure to have you here. It is long overdue. We have streamed so many times together, and certainly have met before. And certainly this is just something I've been looking so forward to, Kamran, so much about this film I'm so passionate about, and I feel that it certainly is a step in the right direction. Everybody, Kamran is an author and filmmaker. You have seen him in so many shows in Hollywood as well as streaming on YouTube. He has a fantastic Patreon, everybody. So do subscribe to Kamran's Patreon, where you can learn about the Pasha method of writing. Certainly is helpful for those of us who want to write and learn more. But without further ado, Kamran, how are you tonight?
Well, I'm delighted. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to be on your channel because many people don't know we met personally when I came to visit New York, and you have such a lovely positive energy that surrounds your channel as well. And so it's delightful to always be on with you, and I feel like you've welcomed me into your home today. So thank you so much for that.
Well, you are welcome, Kamran, anytime. And of course, tonight, Kamran, we are talking about a film called 3,000 Years of Longing. And we are going to have spoilers because, well, we just want to be able to say whatever we want. So if you haven't seen the film yet and you want to, but you don't want it spoilers, maybe go see it and then come back and watch this review. But Kamran and I are going to be talking about so many interesting things about this film. Kamran, this film stars Tilda Swinton as a British scholar who has these visions and finds herself face to face with a jinn played by Idris Elba. It's directed by and written by George Miller, co-writer Augusta Gore, and based on a book called The Din in the Nightmare's Eye. But we both know that it's also based on much more older historical stories that go back for centuries. Kamran, I've seen reviews of this film. And so many of the reviewers, not all, but so many of them seem a bit confused, not understanding the film entirely. And when I look at a film like this, I think it deals with loneliness and romance. And it's something that I've often said that we need more romance, right, Kamran?
Well, absolutely. And we've lost that a little bit in Hollywood. Often, the classic romances that we watch with Clark Gable and others, they've been cheapened. We have lots of sex, lots of sensuality, but romance has been kind of lost, and it's delightful to have that feeling here.
Yes, it really is. And it almost makes me think that, modern tastes are out of touch with these basic sentiments of what you go to see a film for. We certainly do realize that there are elements that we all seek to see in a film. And, honestly, this film talks about gosh, it's so expansive, Kamran. We see famous people like the Queen of Sheba, Murad, the fourth Sultan, and then of the Ottoman Empire, and of course, Ibrahim, another Sultan of the time period, a housewife from that time. And I thought that these adaptations were beautiful and quite mesmerizing. What did you think about the level of storytelling along with the imagery in this film?
Well, it's interesting. You start off talking about the Pasha method that I share on my Patreon, which is an actual method of screenwriting that I've developed that I've not seen anyone else come up with. And as you know, as someone who's seen it, it's very much based on structure. based on act structure and plot, and the challenges that come from the specifically delineated turning points that we would expect in traditional storytelling. And it's not, these act structure points are coming out of, they're not just, I made them up, they're traditional Hollywood structure, but, Aristotle was talking about them, 2,500 years ago in On Poetics, which is a wonderful book you can all get on Amazon today in translation. It's still a great book on storytelling. But so with that said, so what's interesting about this film is that it is very much, it doesn't follow that. It's intentionally nonlinear in many ways. I discussed this. I did a sort of a private review for the Patreon where I talked about that this is very much an art film, and art films for me are hit or miss, right? I'm not a fan of many of them because I think many of them are a little pretentious, but this one isn't. This one is very heartfelt, and the lack of linearity in the storytelling is embedded within it because it is in some ways very much an homage to the Arabian Nights, 1001 Nights tales. And you can see it from the very beginning because the opening shot is of an airplane flying to Istanbul, Turkey, and it is Scheherazade Airlines, right? And so that's very much an intentional homage to Scheherazade, who is the great storyteller of the Arabian Nights tales. And those are not linear tales. I mean, that's the genius of the stories, that there's a frame story of Scheherazade and her adventures with her husband, the Mad Sultan, who, is going to kill her after their wedding night because he's mad. And she talks him out of killing her that first night by telling him a story. And then she finishes it at the cliffhanger and says, well, sunrise, I guess I'm going to die now. So he's like, no, I want to hear the rest of the story. It's all right, I'm going to give you one more night. And then that night she tells another story, and within that, a story within a story, and then stops at the cliffhanger again. And so every night he's addicted to hearing the rest of the story, and this goes on for 3 years, 1001 Nights. And so the genius of that story structure of the original 1001 Nights, which were oral tales, which really weren't compiled into a book until, probably middle, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, but they were orally transmitted before, is that they're tales within tales, which is a kind of an element of this, right? And so it is storytelling that can be a little startling to people because we're not used to this kind of storytelling, but it works because this is an homage to the Arabian Nights.
Absolutely, Kamran. And, I think if viewers never heard of these stories or the people in them, that they can easily understand them in this historical context that they're presented. And I couldn't help but notice how important specifically the jinn's role was on a personal level. And I have to ask this question. I don't know as much about, jinns as I'd like to think I do, but are jinns this personal? Because this character seems to be touching the most intimate moments in the rest of the characters' lives, and even in his own. Can you elaborate a little bit on that concept of it?
Yeah, and actually it is authentic, and I'll explain why. But first, let me clarify what jinn are, because you have the Western mythology of the genie, which is the form that appears in here. But this is actually more accurate to the Islamic stories in many ways because it goes into their nature, which the movie talks about it. They're electromagnetic in nature. That's how we would define them through modern science. But in the Quranic stories, they are beings made of energy. Human beings are made of earth. Angels are made of light. And then Quran, there's these entities that are in between those two forms, which are called the jinn, which literally means the invisible, the hidden ones, that they live amongst us all the time. They can see us, but we can't see them because they're hidden from us in a dimension that our senses normally cannot penetrate into. And they're made of smokeless fire, which is interpreted modern ways. Muslim scholars today will say that's plasma or that's electromagnetic energy. So that, and the movie talks about that and actually talks about what the effects of electromagnetism in the modern world could have on a jinn who's entering into this modern world. So that's their nature. And in the Islamic tradition, the jinn, they're not, they're not demons. They can be demonic, as in they can be good or evil. In this movie, there's a good jinn, right? But and that's the very much the Islamic position, that these entities have free will like human beings do. They do not have physical form in the way that we do. And the Islamic story is that when Adam arose, essentially we took the world from the jinn. They were our predecessor race that inhabited the earth, and we took the world from them. And so many of them resent that they lost out this planet to this new race that's essentially come and block them. Because that's a story behind that. But there's an aspect of it that most people do not know. In fact, I would suggest many Muslims do not know this. But the Quran talks about that every human being has a companion, which is called a qareen. So the qareen is actually a jinn that essentially is attached to human beings from birth onwards. It's their actual sort of double or their companion. And in that way, it is a very intimate journeyman. And if they are, they can be the whisperer of evil in your heart or of good, depending on their nature, right? But everyone has this entity a unique jinn entity that sort of follows human beings from birth, that's connected to them. And so that explains the intimacy that we explore here, because this particular jinn in this story is not attached to her from birth. She releases it from a bottle, very much like the Arabian Nights mythology. But it goes back to mythology, which you don't know the origin of these things, which is King Solomon. The Islamic stories put them into these containers, bottles, clay jars, all that kind of stuff, and they were trapped in there, because the Quran says that the King Solomon was given the power to control jinn, and so the Temple of Jerusalem was built by them under Solomon's command, that kind of thing. And then once he was done using them, he essentially sealed them away in their other dimension, and we see that here in this movie. So that is the intimate nature of it. These beings are all around us, and each of us has a personal Kareem. Each of us has a personal jinn, so as an intimate companion in our lifetime, who knows us. And that's kind of what's depicted here.
Yeah, Cameron, I have to say that I was quite blown away by it in general, and I think that it was a loving depiction of the jinn. And regardless of, let's say, motivation of either an individual, this certainly was a different side that I haven't seen normally depicted, and it was refreshing, and it made sense, and it almost gave a greater level of relevance of the jinn to me, and I think made the story itself even more relevant. And something else that happens in the story, Cameron, Althea says, this main character says, she thinks she doesn't need or wish for anything, and I thought that was very interesting, because listening to the jinn tell her these stories clearly awakens something in her. But she's a learned woman, and Cameron, she seeks out the exotic. She's in Istanbul in Turkey. Clearly, she must know some of these stories. Is it the delivery of the stories or the jinn itself, do you think, that sways Althea towards her decision to pursue this jinn?
Well, they're connected, right? He is the deliverer of the story, but he's also the manifestation of it. And so it's what I talked about in my Patreon article for the Patreon members about my personal review of it. This is very much a commentary on where we are, especially in Western society, with our sense of our malaise that comes from thinking we understand the world completely, right? That we think we're a rational, scientific people that have mastered the world. We put man on the moon kind of thing, and we have all this technology. We got phones, blah, 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 blah. But in the process, we have all this technology that would appear magical to people 100 years ago. That is magic, right? And yet at the same time, we have all this technology that appears magical. We can sit in a metal tube that flies in the sky, right? Like a flying carpet, right? The airplane. But we've lost our personal sense of magic. Life has become so, life has become so dry because we think we've mastered the material world and understood its mysteries and laid it out. And that is where she is, where Althea is someone who's a scholar, who's a detached intellectual, who is very much representative of the current European and American mindset, certainly in those classes of thinking they'll know everything. In the process, it leads to a sense of loss of your humanity, right? Because the childlike wonder that the universe is magical, full of unexplained things and new experiences is lost to people that believe they've conquered the world. So that's why this is a unique story, because in pretty much every story about a jinn, going back to the Arabian Nights, you have they start off the stereotype. I'm here to give you 3 wishes because you release me. But I've never come across a story where the person doesn't actually have any wishes, because they think that they're internally fulfilled when they're not. What it is, the reason that she doesn't have any wishes is that she's disconnected from her soul. So she doesn't even know who she is. She doesn't know she's lost her humanity. She doesn't know what her heart's longing is, because she doesn't have a connection to her heart. And it is through telling these stories, he's trying to awaken in her that childlike connection to the heart. And then she finds what it is that she's longing for, which is actually companionship, which is, again, a commentary on where we are in Europe and in the West.
It certainly is. And of course, this Althea character is very arrogant, and she feels quite justified in saying the things that she is saying. And truth be told, I think initially, while she is amazed by what she's seeing, they did allude to the fact that maybe she had some visions or perhaps an intuition, some sort of perception of what was going on. And I'd like to think that these visions that she's seeing was clearly the jinn trying to get her attention, even while he was in the bottle at some point, because we know he has abilities to do things like this. Those feelings and thoughts and, desires that you have, even in the subconscious, have to come from somewhere. So it's nice.
Well, and also the jinn don't exist within our time within our
Right.
time frame, so they can influence past and future, right? And so he could be the future. In the future, when he's released by her, he influences her past.
Absolutely. And, I think that being able to connect, let's say, something so ancient to something so modern is one of the great accomplishments of this film. Do you think that a film like this, Cameron, is setting or showing us a trend towards seeing more traditional storytelling?
It could be, except that unfortunately the movie is not. Most people haven't seen it, right? And so, and part of it, I would actually blame the studio's marketing department, which disastrously marketed this movie. Nobody knew about it, and also the way they put it out there. They put it out as a wide release without marketing it, and so of course it's not going to succeed commercially. What they should have done was, number one, marketed the hell out of this. Is George Miller, the creator of Mad Max, right? And
Yes.
take you into the world of the genies in a way you've never seen before, and with his stunning visual style. And then they've done a limited release in New York, London, Los Angeles, a few big markets, maybe Miami. Get the feedback from crowds that are like, oh, I'm seeing a special George Miller movie, and then word of mouth spread it into a wide release. But they mishandled this completely, and I have my personal theories as to why they mishandled it. I mean, because it's quite shocking. It's because 21 years as a Muslim guy in Hollywood, Hollywood has no interest whatsoever in normalizing Muslim culture, none. And so, when someone like a George Miller comes out, they can't say no to him, but they can sabotage his release, which I think is what happened here.
It's a shame that that happened. Honestly, I felt that the marketing campaign, specifically the trailer, did a good job
Mm-hmm.
of introducing the notion of we're going to show you something you've never seen. Perhaps it doesn't say that, but when the genie appears, larger than life size, so to speak, colossal
Mm-hmm.
size, I think that was implied. And right away,
Mm-hmm.
that grabs your attention. It is Idris Elba who's playing the role. And certainly,
Mm-hmm.
he's an attractive man, certainly grabs the attention. This is a huge fantasy, I think, for a lot of women. And
Mm-hmm.
honestly, there's
Sure.
a scene in the advertisement where she sees her two friends and
Mm-hmm.
says, oh, this guy's going to be staying for a while. And immediately, he draws their attention. It's not just what he looks like, it's the charisma of the
Sure.
jinn. So
Sure.
there is that element too. What I also think that Idris Elba manages to pull off so
Mm-hmm.
well, as he is also telling the story. And I want to talk a little bit about imagination, and
Yeah.
specifically in storytelling for TV and movies. Recently, I've seen some adaptations of classical literature, and I'm not going to say which ones, and I'm not going to say it's Western or, from other
Mm-hmm.
cultures as well.
Sure.
But let's
Sure.
just say that these adaptations of classic literature we've been seeing are clearly missing that romance, that appeal and mysticism we would expect from stories that would have them inherently, like sci-fi, fantasy, things of that nature. So, is
Mm-hmm.
there pressure to conform today, to not take risks in projects that would traditionally be known for taking a risk of having that mysticism, that imagination?
Well, I think I know which project you're talking about, but generally it's part of a phenomenon that you're discussing, which has actually been developing for several years, to the detriment of Hollywood, which is characters like Althea, who think they know everything but are completely disconnected from their heart and soul, are the ones running storytelling. At least have been for some time. It's changing now, but for some time they have been. And I'm actually going to go back even before some of the fantasy projects that are out that people are critiquing as maybe not capturing the magic and mysticism and wonder of the original material. Is actually, it started, and it's always, and I'm a student of religion, it starts with religion. And I noticed that when you started a few years ago, about 10 years ago, when a lot of the garbage was really being built up that really damaged our cultural situation. It started off with Hollywood's efforts to deconstruct religion. So you had movies like Ridley Scott's, movie on Moses. I think what was the title of Kings and Pharaohs or something, Kings and Prophets, something like that. And then you actually had that movie about Noah that was done by Darren Aronofsky, right? And all of those are efforts to deconstruct the magic and mysticism of these major biblical stories. The Ridley Scott is a wonderful filmmaker, but he's a very proud and loud atheist. And so his approach to the Moses story is very much that all of the events, the miraculous events of Moses, can be attributed to coincidental scientific events that happen, right? And it's just, we give them the meaning that this is God intervening in history. Well, that's not of any value to the people who care about that story. Moses, it's not just Jews and Christians. Obviously, Moses is central to Judaism and Christianity. He's absolutely central to Islam. Moses is the most talked about character in the Quran. And the Prophet Muhammad is mentioned, I believe, 3 or 4 times. Jesus is mentioned dozens of times, and Moses is mentioned hundreds of times. Moses is the most important character in the Quran, and so that story is drilled in to about a quarter of this planet, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Right, about 25% of the planet are drawn into that incredible story and its wonder and its magic and its mysticism and its romance, all of it. And so you have all these people attempting to deconstruct that, and those movies weren't successful, right? Because they didn't get the heart of it. My favorite movie of all time of all time is the Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille, right, with Charlton Heston. That's my number one movie of all time. It's the first movie I ever saw, and it put me on as a child, it put me on my own personal spiritual path, which has dominated my life, right? And that's because that movie embraced the magic and mysticism and just went with it, right? That the Red Sea is splitting open and God is speaking through fire and all of that, and pillar of fire, and that's reality. And that is what these stories mean, because our hearts are moved by these stories. They're not moved by materialist interpretations of these events. So you can, that is what Althea represents, is someone who is so trapped in her mind that she's disconnected from the deeper realities that cannot be explained by reason. And again, that is science, because we know from basic quantum physics, one of the most fundamental principles of quantum physics, is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, that the great quantum physicist, early 20th century Heisenberg, stated that it is fundamentally impossible to know all things, because the building blocks of reality, the quantum particles, you can only measure one of two things at once. You can either measure their location or measure their momentum, their speed. The process of trying to figure out where they are essentially freezes them in space, so you don't know their speed. And the process to figure out how fast they're going prevents you from actually knowing where they are at any given moment, because it's instantaneous, right? And so it's inherently impossible to know one of two things about how the universe works. So that's the fundamental uncertainty that's in the universe. And it is our spiritual understanding, which includes faith, it includes love, it includes romance, it includes all these things that materialists attempt to turn into things, what we call reifying, to make something physical that you can deconstruct it. A materialist will say that there is no soul, but nobody actually believes that. No human being believes that they are the product of random electrons firing in their brain. They say that, but nobody actually believes that there's no such thing as love and art and they don't believe that, but they'll say the words. Althea is the example. She does not believe what she is saying. She is saying, I don't want anything. She is lying. She is longing for more than this material world, but she has to be a rational academic. So she says the mantra, even though the heart knows the mantra is false. So the moment the heart is given the chance to experience faith and love and magic, it takes it.
Exactly. Now, I noticed, Kamran, that let's say it's towards the end of the film, when the Jinn has decided to travel back to the UK with the character Althea, that he has trouble, or let's say, or some difficulty surviving the modern world. And it kind of takes a selfless wish, meaning I wish he would be okay, to save him. Yes. And it's true. I really do like the idea that the Jinn does come back to see Althea from time to time. But why do you think, is it realistic to think that this Jinn would have trouble surviving in the modern world?
Well, it is realistic within Islamic cosmology, because there's rules as to that the Jinn cannot enter our world for long periods of time, because it's essentially, a Sufi master said this to me recently. He said, the Jinn live longer than us. They live thousands of years, as is shown in this film. This Jinn, goes back to the days of Solomon, right? But they're not immortal. They have lives. They are born in the Islamic tradition. They actually have, because even this Jinn falls in love with the Queen of Sheba. That's what starts his adventure, right? And so they have partners in their world. They have reproduction and they have children. And they live and they die. They're mortal like us, right? But they just live at a massive time span in their dimension. So the Sufi master will tell you today that one of the things that God has given them is, I will give you life beyond what human beings have, but if you enter their world, you become mortal. That's why we're not flooded with Jinn. The Muslim belief is Jinn are all around us all the time in their parallel dimension, shadow dimension. They can see us, we can't see them. But why do they not show up every 5 minutes and manifest? Because you could kill them. You could kill them. And there's actual things like iron weapons and whatever could kill them. That's a traditional view, that if a jinn physically appears, if you got an iron dagger, just stab it, because you can kill this thing. And that's why they don't want to come to this world, because their 10,000-year lifespan might become 5 seconds if someone kills them, right? And then because the belief is they're made of energy, it is certainly within the realm of believability that electromagnetic fields that we are now covering this planet with, the 5G radiation would affect them, because they are beings on a wavelength. And so when it's just basic, science of wave interference, when you have a counteracting electronic wave, that it could disrupt their bodies, which is what we see in this movie. But the deeper issue, now going back to the romance of it, is she has to make that wish, because I've never seen that wish ever be done in any of these stories. All stories, as she points out in this movie, all genie stories are 3 wishes that go terribly awry, because they're always based in selfishness, right? They're always based on what I want. And so in this one, she finally learns what love is, which is to be selfless. And so she gives up her power, her wish, to save him, right? And in the process, she discovers what love is, which was the whole journey from the beginning, right? She's left her mind and experienced her heart. And that was the purpose of it. So it's actually quite beautiful.
It is a beautiful story, and certainly, a lesson, I think a greater lesson, if anything else. Something else that I noticed was that one of the characters wanted to have, and I could be interpreting this a little bit differently from what the director intended. They wanted to have the power of knowledge. And it did appear that, the jinn was giving her this power, but then things went very, very wrong.
Mhm.
How can you explain this woman's reaction to a point where she had said, I just wish I didn't even meet you?
Because knowledge is meaningless without the heart. That's the whole point of the movie, that without the heart, the brain is meaningless, and it actually can be quite dangerous, right? It is the it's the tragedy of modern Western materialist civilization, is that we elevate this and deny this, right? We deny the heart. And as a result, you can have science that is based on immorality. I mean, we saw that Dr. Mengele is the perfect example. Nazi scientists who did horrific things, tortured innocent people in order to discover the science of what happens when you rip someone's body apart while they're alive and dissect them and all these horrible things, right? One would suggest that many people in our modern pharmaceuticals world have that mindset as well. I mean, we've had situations where I believe it was Pfizer that just 10 years ago was given the worst criminal penalty of several $billions for fraudulent behavior, right? Because they don't have any sense of empathy they see human beings not from the heart, but from the brain, which is, we are just something to be analyzed, which is the danger of the Western approach to science. And people say there's no Western Eastern approach to science. It's like, no, you don't understand it. There is. It is the ultimate in arrogance to believe that the West invented modern science and the scientific method. It rediscovered it, right? But if you go to ancient China, they were doing all kinds of stuff, right? If science, we've lost a lot of it, of their knowledge on medicine and science, and the Islamic world as well. But both of them approach things from, and the Chinese did this too, from the Taoist perspective, and these Muslims did it from the perspective of, the Quran says, seek knowledge, and the Prophet Muhammad said, seek knowledge even unto China, because again, China was the height of knowledge in history, right? And so the idea is we're seeking knowledge for the sake of God. Like most, Muslims were famous astronomers. Why? Because they had to calculate where Mecca was in order to pray, right? If you're in Spain, or you're in Africa, or you're in India, you need to figure out the direction of Mecca. So number one, that they had to understand that the earth was a globe. And then they had to use the stars to calculate the direction of Mecca. And so that's why they became astronomers. It came out of a spiritual need, a need to serve God brought about the quest for knowledge, right? Whereas we have removed the divinity and the spirituality from the process. So it becomes a quest for knowledge for its own sake, which is the story of the Tower of Babel, right? In the Bible, which is, people seeking to learn the secrets of God for its own sake, or even to rebel against God, and it goes terribly wrong. And I would suggest perhaps the CERN Hadron Collider is an example of that, where we're trying to mess with forces in the quantum field that we do not understand, and we may be altering subatomic reality in very dangerous ways right now, and we just don't know, or we're seeing the phenomenon, maybe the Mandela effect, other things. But yeah, that is the critique of the movie, is that knowledge without the heart is painful and self-destructive. right? It is in the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, they all have Satan, was a smart guy, right? And in all various stories, Satan sort of wanted the knowledge of God, right? And then thought he was God, or thought he was certainly superior to human beings in their knowledge of things, because Satan could see into other worlds and knew all these things that human beings still don't know, right? So how can human beings be a superior creation? And so that is the quest for knowledge without spirituality leads you down that path of destruction and self-destruction.
Yeah, it certainly is something to think about, Cameron. And you
Mhm.
talked about the importance of a film being entertaining and
Mhm.
uplifting. And,
Yes.
we have seen, as I said in the past, many renditions of some of these stories where I don't think that was taken into consideration. For a story that does have such an important spiritual aspect,
Mhm.
what are some key elements in the film do you think that set the uplifting part? Because we certainly know this was entertaining. It was a beautiful looking film. They did such a lovely adaptation of the stories. What were some of the most inspiring and uplifting moments to you?
What the overarching focus on the Ottoman Empire was interesting to me, because the story starts in Yemen, which is where the Queen of Sheba was from, but it then quickly goes to Constantinople, which was what Istanbul used to be called, and it's there for most of the movie, right? It's in Constantinople during various Ottoman sultans and their reigns, and the adventures that this genie is having or not having while he's there, right? And it's fun because I'm currently developing a project set in the Ottoman Empire. So all I will say is that several of the characters that are the central aspects of my story are in this movie. So I was delighted to watch them appear. I was like, oh, they're there. At least now people watching this will be familiar when this character hopefully appears on my show, right? But the reason for this, it's in many ways, this movie is somewhat of a love letter to Turkey. It takes place mostly in Turkey until the third act when they go back to England, but it's mostly in Turkey most of the movie, and from the very beginning, and it's a love letter to that. And I did a little bit of research into George Miller, and I just learned something I didn't know. He is of Greek origin, but George Miller's parents were Ottoman Greek. They lived in Turkey in the
Oh,
Ottoman Empire, and so
interesting.
his parents were born before World War One, and unfortunately, one of the many tragedies of World War One was one of the most broken things that destroyed this world. World War II we think of, but World War One is what began it all, and it changed the world to the world we know it today. And one of the most tragic things is that happened after World War One, as part of sort of the settlement that happened after World War One. The Ottoman Empire was dismantled to the great delight of the British and French colonialists who stole all the countries. Right? That was the whole point of the war for them. They didn't even care that much about Germany. They wanted the entire Middle East, which is what they took from the Ottomans. But part of that is that they made, Greece and Turkey had been adversarial for some time, because Greece had been an Ottoman colony for several hundred years and then was able to attain independence, right? And so there were large Greek communities in Turkey, in modern Turkey, in Ottoman Empire, who considered themselves Ottoman, because Christians and Jews are all Ottomans. They just happen to be in this country. And so part of the arrangement was that after World War One, the Turkish communities that lived in Greece would be forcibly shipped to modern Turkey, and the
Mm.
Greek communities that lived in Turkey would be forcibly shipped. It was a population exchange. They didn't have a choice in the matter. So both communities were forced to go to these other countries that shared their ethnicity but weren't their countries, right? It's like picking me up and forcing me to go to Pakistan against my will. This is my country, right? But that's what his parents had to endure. So his love for Turkey comes from the fact his parents were Turkish, Greek Turkish, but they were Turkish. So this is the love story that we're seeing there. That's why there's so much affection in all those, in the showing of the Constantinople and the Ottoman world, and because he is rediscovering his own heritage, Mr. Miller, in doing this movie.
Certainly, and there were some scenes in there where I felt I was traveling back in time and seeing some of the most extraordinary moments in time. In particular, the production design, as you had already mentioned, Cameron, I felt was, second to none. The beauty and the artistry in a lot of the design was just stunning. What about some of the other cultural significance of what we saw? We did see, I know the Queen of Sheba, I think, requested a specific song. I hope I have the right section down because I can't remember all the details. And we have this beautiful song that's being played. And I wondered some of the other culturally significant things that you found in the film that they chose to put in.
Well, yeah, I mean, the culture sensitive things go all the way back to, again, the production design is that you get a lavish sense of the Ottoman palace, which a lot of the story takes place in, and so that's very beautifully done. And there's a little bit of Orientalism to it. I think there's an exoticism. People always have an exoticism around the harems and things like that. That goes back. That's impossible to get out of the Western imagination. And hopefully my show moves forward because it's very centrally placed in one of the Ottoman harems. So you see the harem as a lot more of a practical place than it is this sort of sensual, exotic place where belly dancers are, all that stuff. That's more of a Western exoticization of it. And George has that, because that perspective. But it's still beautiful, and it's entertainment. The colors are lavish. It's a very colorful film. And the colors bring life to it, which is also, I think, a subconscious thing of, Althea's world is very drab. It's very drab and not very colorful. And so whenever the Jinn is telling the stories, they're vivid color, because that's what she's lost. In losing this, she's lost the color of her life.
Certainly. And throughout the film, the music is incredible, as we were just talking about. I know that Andrea Bocelli's son, Matteo Bocelli, starts to sing at the end of this particular film, and probably sings in quite a few segments of it. Obviously, this is a romance. And, I think that when I looked at some of the other reviewers' comments about the film and being confused, I think that they were incredibly disconnected from that romantic aspect, but also because perhaps they do have some sort of idea that, romance cannot be associated with a story like this. But it's actually kind of surprising when the stories themselves are so romantic. It does make me very concerned in the sense of, what are people looking at when they're watching movies like this? So I think that, when it comes to an aesthetic, it's very important to kind of look at a story like this when they're, like when you go to a theater, and try and understand that, this story is a romance. Initially, it does not appear to be that. And I think that the marketing, like I said before, that trailer that they had clearly shows a romance, because, Althea kind of, betrays herself, because you can see by the look on her face that she's kind of fallen for this character. So that's another thing I did want to
there's a parallel. I don't know if you remember, there's a parallel where when the Queen of Sheba falls in love with Solomon, you see that she gulps, right? She gulps. And then later in the movie, you see the moment where Althea gulps. When he's talking about when he fell in love with a human being in one of his other adventures. She gulps because she finally, first of all, that's the moment she realizes he could fall in love with a human being. Maybe he could fall in love with me, right? Yeah, that's the moment where she realizes that it's possible.
See, I can't help but wondering, I almost want to seek out more stories where there are romances. And I'm not saying it has to be, Jinn romances, but it seems very interesting, the idea of this romantic side of Jinn that I've never seen before. And I'm absolutely fascinated by it. So, just to be honest with you, Kamran, I think it's
I'm sorry, I interrupted you, please.
No, I finished pretty much just absolutely fascinated by it, and just completely, it's kind of swept me off my feet in a sense, in the way that it was shown to us, and it was done with so much care. I think Idris Elba, I don't know whether he'd ever be nominated for anything, but this truly was a role that I think he made come alive in a way I've never seen before.
Yeah, he's not just playing the handsome guy who's charming. He is that, but he's now this wondrous figure, right? Larger than life, quite literally. But he makes him relatable, because he's a figure that's driven by emotion. He gets into trouble because he falls in love with the Queen of Sheba, and that Solomon doesn't like that. And his constant trouble is his inability to just accept things as they are, right? He's always trying to change things, and which is different from Alethea, who's just floating through life, sort of like a zombie, right? And so he's this constant active person. But to respond to the thing about the romance, again, this is something that would shock people in the West, which is that part of the Islamic belief about jinn is that they can reproduce with humans. There, and that's a modern belief to this day. It's part of the ancient belief. It's pre-Islamic Middle East. The idea of them having intercourse with humans, having families with humans. In some ways, you've got an element of that in the Silmarillion in J.R.R. Tolkien's seminal work, where he has, I believe, it was Melian the Great. She was a Maiar, one of the timeless sort of angel gods, who comes and falls in love with an elf, and she marries him, and then she gives birth to Luthien, who is the most fairest of all creation, right? So the idea of these pairings between spiritual beings and human beings is very ancient, and the reason I use that example, not, let's say, the pairings that are in Greek myths or whatever, because those are mostly just Zeus getting laid, right? There isn't a lot of romance in them. Zeus impregnating some poor woman and taking off, and Hercules is born, right? That they're not that romantic. Whereas there is a romance to this, and but I'm saying this is very much a living idea today. When my spiritual Sufi masters are in West Africa and Senegal, so last time I visited them, they were telling me a story about their little village in Africa, and they're telling me a story about the next door village, about story from, they say, just happened just a few years before. And this is the story they claim. I believe it. Why not? And the story is that there was a gentleman that had married a jinn, and she had taken human form, and he knew she was a jinn, just like we've got here the genie in London with her, and she knows he's a jinn, and others just see him as a sexy guy that's her boyfriend, right? And he had married her, but she had put one rule that every night, I guess the full moon or whatever, some special night, that she had to have a private room and hut by herself, where she was to be left alone. He was never to come in during that night. And so she would do that, and for years they were fine. And he was always wondering, what the hell is she doing in there that night, right? And what he would discover is that that's the night when her jinn form takes over her human form. So the story is from the neighboring village of how one night he just couldn't, keep his curiosity, very much like Pandora, right? So one night he sneaks in when his jinn wife is in the hut, and he peeks through essentially the keyhole to see what's going on in there. And the story is, the last thing he saw was, he saw a flash of her in an image as sort of a bird-like creature, like a bird-human hybrid. And she immediately, her talon comes out and pokes his eye out for having the audacity to see her that way, right? And so that's the story from the next door village, from 2010 or whatever. That is very much a belief that these beings are with us, and that there are hybrid beings. There's a whole Morocco, Algeria, there's all kinds of traditions of stories, modern day stories of hybrid children that appear to be human, but their parents actually have jinn, and they have supernatural powers. So that's part of the folklore, and not just folklore, it's part of the actual belief of people. So again, this movie is the first one that explores that possibility. You've never seen it before.
And the final question that I have for you, because I know that you have to go at the top of the hour.
Minutes, yeah.
I wanted to say that I noticed in it, and it's kind of in the picture here, that a good portion of this takes place in this hotel room, especially some of the most colorful parts of the story. What did you think about them deciding to use this hotel room as the background for, one of the most colorful depictions of these stories that I personally have ever seen? I don't think I've seen a better depiction of those stories. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Kamran?
Well, it wasn't just an average hotel room in Istanbul. They made it very clear. It is the hotel room that Agatha Christie stayed in when she wrote Murder on the Orient Express, right? So Alethea is very much the symbol of the Agatha Christie, this literary writer, scholar from Europe who comes to the Middle East and falls in love with it, which is what happened to Agatha Christie. She's actually became a little bit of an Orientalist. She became obsessed with the Middle East. She spent a lot of time in Egypt. And that's why when she writes, Death on the Nile, it's because she was there, right? And, she actually, if you read her books, there's a lot of Middle Eastern references and a little bit of knowledge of Islamic culture and mythology and stories. She was very much obsessed with it. And that's what happens to Althea. She comes there sort of the British colonial mindset of, these dumb wogs, and then falls in love with these people and feels like she can learn from them. So there's a reason that it took place in that hotel room, because that's a journey that Althea has to go through. But it's also an example of Althea being trapped, in this modern world She had all of this magical world. She's in Istanbul, which is one of my favorite cities on earth. I've been there several times. Everyone should go see it. I mean, it's stunningly beautiful, and all the history going back, the Islamic history, the Christian history, the Roman and the Greek history, and then the pre-Greek history, the Trojan history. It just doesn't end, and it's all preserved. And so how does she enjoy that world? By sitting in her hotel room.
That's
She's
right.
locked into this little world. She doesn't experience life. She's in the most magical city on the planet, and she's not experiencing it. So that's a commentary.
It certainly is. And, I do have to give them so much credit, this production team, Cameron, the actors, everything, the imagery, some things that I've never seen before in
Mm-hmm.
imagery, which
Mm-hmm.
might have some significance. For example, the spider uh, part, and also the invisibility part, Cameron, which is something that I haven't really seen explored. The idea, just imagine the idea. And I think Darth Plato is talking about, is it the Haifa Sophia? Maybe.
The
Um,
Hagia Sophia, yeah, the Hagia Sophia, yeah, which is stunningly beautiful. I actually have I've explored it several times. Once with an actual historian who showed me the original cut marks on the ground where the architects had dug like marks to start making the measurements. They're still there. I mean, there's like marks on the stone marble of the floor where, okay, this is where the architect stood in 400 AD and started mapping out the mathematics of the place. So it's beautiful.
It certainly is. And, as I said, Mike Alito said something about it looked like it was Aladdin for adults, but I did just want to say it's not Mike Alito. This is a much more complex
Mhm.
story. I'm not putting down Aladdin. I'm just saying that this is a different story about a modern woman,
Mhm.
Mike Alito, and her dealing with her true feelings and spirituality. So that's what this film is about to me, and romance. So if you like those things, if you want to, what I would consider a mature film for mature tastes, done in a way that's respectful, that's colorful, that's, uplifting, this is the film for you. It's culturally significant. I don't think I could have done that. This film couldn't have been done any better. I think it's practically a perfect film. Cameron, you mentioned a lot
Mhm.
about physics, about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle.
Mhm.
We do see the Hadron Collider in this film,
We
Cameron.
do. That's intentional. That because why does he go there? You actually see him there in the machinery. I immediately ding 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 when I saw that because it's a commentary on the whole point of the movie, which is that the arrogance of modern materialists that think they can understand the mysteries of the universe without consequence, right? He is one of the mysteries of the universe. You talk about invisibility. Much of this film is about his adventure when he's trapped in Istanbul, when he's unable to take any form for like over a century, and he's essentially a walking phantom. And that is the first time I've ever seen the perspective of, because the jinn are the hidden ones living amongst us, and what it's like to be living amongst human beings and outliving them and being amongst them for hundreds of years, and nobody can see you and nobody can talk to you. I mean, that's an interesting perspective.
It certainly is an interesting perspective, Cameron. And, I wonder, so, at the conclusion of this film, Althea finds out that, after her selfless wishes,
Yes.
things are not exactly, I'm not quite sure how they're supposed to be. And that's okay, because this would be ridiculous if it was something where everything was fine and, it worked out a certain way. It needed to be as complicated as real life is complicated, everybody. So it's a situation where he's able to come back from time to time. And, since he does have a very long lifetime, she sees him occasionally. But I thought that it was important to show a realistic outcome, because he couldn't have that existence of being there when she comes home from work. He that just wasn't realistic. And I almost wondered if that was a commentary too. But I was happy for that, Cameron. I wasn't upset. And I think that that's very interesting. It was enough to say that he would be there from time to time. What do you make of that conclusion, or let's say interpretation of time? Because for him, he's lived for so long. I don't know what his perspective from a time point of view is. What did you think of that?
Well, that is the it goes back to the archetypal idea of the curse of immortality, right? I mean, yeah, in the movie they're portrayed as immortal. They're not in the Islamic tradition. They can, like I said, they can be killed. They have lifespans, whatever, but their lifespans are far beyond ours. But the very much the idea of immortality, which is the curse of it, which is you get to see all your loved ones pass away. So what is the point of living in a world you have immortal life, but you're lonely, right? So look at it just so happened by synchronicity. What am I drinking from? This is my Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Tepes mug that I got in Romania, right? And
Yeah.
Vlad Tepes was the Ottoman Empire's major adversary, right?
Yes.
And famously so. Uh, but and that's the example of eternal life, which I think is captured to a degree in the actual original novel. It's also captured. The tragedy of eternal life is very much actually captured, well, not to a degree. It's very much captured in Bram Stoker's novel, more so than the films. I think the Coppola film came close to understanding it, but the movie, one of the, there something no one ever realizes that's in the books is that when the vampires are killed in the Bram Stoker book, they breathe a sigh of relief and their face goes to peace because they're trapped in this immortal thing that's misery. They can't, their immortality is misery, it's loneliness, it is suffering. And even at the end, when Dracula is killed, the final thing is his soul, his body is at peace after he's killed at the end of the book. So that's Bram Stoker in the 1800s understanding that. And so that's the poignancy of this, is that we've seen the Jinn has outlived all of these people he loved. He loved the Queen of Sheba, he loves another character. He has a very tragic experience with both of them. And there's a tragedy as well, is that he comes to love Alethea and he can't be with her because her world is not safe for him. And so she will eventually pass on, but he gave her a gift. He couldn't give the other women that were on his journey a gift that stayed with them. Sheba left him for Solomon. The other woman essentially forgot him. And so whatever gifts he gave her were lost. But with Althea, he's left her this gift of rediscovery. And that's the poignancy, because ultimately all of our relationships, very few of us, some of us are blessed to have that one soulmate you meet in high school and you stay with them till you're 85 and you pass away with them. Very few of us have that. Most of us are struggling to find a partner. If we find a partner, they're not always a partner that stays with us for life. They stay with us for life. We're not always happy with them, right? And so there's a tragedy in trying to connect between two souls. It's a tragedy the Jinn will always experience, right? And so I think there's a very poignant ending.
It certainly is. And Kamran, any final thoughts on the film before we wrap up tonight?
Well, I think people should see it. I mean, my warning is it is an art film. It's not a linear film. It probably doesn't follow traditional story structure. I think the third act, when we are no longer in the Jim's reminiscences of the magical experience he's had, when we're actually in England and on her adventures in England, I think it becomes very slow, which is unusual. Third act is where things ramp up, right? And so I mean, it's not going to be for everyone. If you approach it from that, if you're coming in to see Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, you won't get that. But you will get this very beautiful meditation on the nature of love and life and reason and what we've lost in our modern world, right? So it's worth the time to go see it. And it's worth slogging through the moments that may appear slow to you, because they're meditative moments. And I say that as someone who's often, like I said, doesn't really like art films, because I think often the meditation is pretense. It's not pretense in this case. It's very real meditation on the nature of life, and it's worth the time to experience the silence of those longer moments where you're like, well, nothing's really happening in this film, but something is happening. It's happening to you internally.
Well, Kamran, I couldn't agree more. I was going to say that this film has a little bit of everything in just the right amounts. It makes the perfect film. Something that I still am wrapping my head around is the orders of magnitude.
No.
So I am absolutely fascinated when they decided, or when the director decided to make the Jinn enormous. I love stuff like that. That really grabs me. Fascinating, and I think in the manner that it was done initially was also very fascinating. And then let's say he changes his size gradually, but it is done for effect, but it's done right.
Yeah.
And it is like a fantasy, Kamran. This really hits a lot of the markers for romance, for, compelling story, for a dilemma. What will happen to him? How is he going to survive falling in love? Maybe her for the first time in her life. This might have been the first time that she's really ever fallen in love for someone
She
without.
had a husband, but it didn't work out. It wasn't the same kind of love that she experiences here.
Exactly. And, she's falling in love. And so often when we do fall in love, there's all these distractions and things happening. But that wasn't the case here. She had to judge him for what he did, for who he was, versus anything else that we might normally judge a person. And I think that that's also very interesting. It truly is about the individual here. And yes, the din is played by Idris Elba, but I'd like to think no matter what this din looks like, she would have fallen head over heels for this person, no
Mhm.
matter what. Guys, this is a love story, but it's also based on stories that are centuries old. You will not be disappointed in 3,000 years of longing. I don't know why we have had to wait so long for a film like this, Kamran.
Well, it takes someone like a George Miller who can force it down the throat of the studio system, and then of course they'll betray him in how they then distribute it to make sure it doesn't succeed. And those are a conversation for another time. But it's my own experience that these are not intentional. These are not unintentional errors. They are intentionally done to make sure people don't see this film, because there's a lot of Hollywood resistance to that culture in particular, and to
Yeah.
normalizing it, and to experiencing the lessons of this movie. There's a lot of resistance internally to people who make the decisions, who have disconnected from their souls as well.
Yes, and I also did want to mention that it still has not been released everywhere, Cameron. So maybe there is still, maybe it can rack in a few more dollars, but I have a feeling it's going to be a cult classic
Oh,
regardless,
it
because
will.
it's such a beautiful film. Guys, please do watch this film. Cameron, where can people find you again?
Well, the best place, that I've got to, you can see my stuff on Instagram. I don't post much there, but every now and then you'll see my trips to wherever I'm going. But Kamran Pasha 72 on Instagram. The most active place where people interact with me is, of course, my Patreon, which I threw a link into the chat. It's where I've got, as you've mentioned, I've got my, not only my daily sort of Hollywood perspective on Hollywood events that are happening. I share my storytelling methods, my personal method of storytelling. I do consulting services for writers. I just did a consulting session with one of the Patreon members who had written a fantasy novel, and I went through the entire novel with him, and hopefully helped him put him in a direction. And we've had people taking the consulting sessions and written then or rewritten scripts that have now won awards. I've had two clients win actual awards in screenwriting contest after we fixed their script together. So that's the best way to interact with me, and I hope people will come join.
Yes, guys, if you are working on a script or anything like this, please do seek out Cameron. He is open and available for consultation, guys. So please do that. Cameron, thank you for joining us tonight. It's been such a pleasure talking about a film that I love and I know you love as well. We hope everybody who's here tonight and everybody who watches this will grow to love this film. And everybody, you can find me here on Positive Fandom or on the Post Geek Singularity. I just want to thank Tom Jr. Jackson for modding tonight. We are all good people. And for everybody out there, no matter where you are, no matter what you're doing, always remember to please be kind. Take care,
Mhm.
everybody. Bye.